Marcus had served the royal family for 12 years. His father served before him and his grandfather before that. The uniform he wore carried the weight of 3 generations of loyalty. Every morning, he stood at his post near the grand entrance watching the marble hallways fill with courtiers and servants. The palace was his entire world, and he knew every corner of it. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The sun rose over the palace gardens, casting long shadows across the stone corridors. Marcus adjusted his ceremonial sword and nodded to the other guards taking their positions. The breakfast service was underway in the royal dining hall. Kitchen staff moved quickly with silver trays. The smell of fresh bread and coffee drifted through the passages. Prince Alexander arrived first, as he always did. He was the eldest son, heir to the throne, and carried himself with the practiced grace of someone born to rule. Marcus bowed as the prince passed. Alexander acknowledged him with a brief nod, his mind clearly elsewhere. There was tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that Marcus had learned to recognize over the years. 20 minutes later, Princess Helena made her entrance. She was younger by 2 years but possessed a fierce intelligence that often overshadowed her brother. Her dress rustled against the marble floor as she walked. Marcus noticed she avoided looking toward the dining hall where Alexander sat. Instead, she turned down the corridor leading to the library wing. The king and queen maintained separate morning routines. Queen Margaret preferred breakfast in her private chambers, surrounded by her ladies. King Edmund took his meals in his study, buried in state documents and correspondence. It had been this way for months. The staff whispered about it in the servant quarters, but Marcus kept his thoughts to himself. A good guard saw everything and said nothing. Around mid-morning, Marcus heard raised voices echoing from the west wing. He straightened instinctively, his hand moving closer to his sword hilt. The sound was coming from the council chamber. It was unusual for any noise to escape those thick oak doors. The room was designed specifically to keep private conversations private. Thomas, another guard stationed nearby, caught his eye. They exchanged a meaningful glance but remained at their posts. The voices grew louder. Marcus could make out Alexander's deep tones, sharp with anger. Then Helena's voice cut through, equally forceful. The words were muffled, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. A door slammed. The sound reverberated through the corridor like thunder. Princess Helena emerged from the council chamber, her face flushed with anger. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. She walked past Marcus without seeing him, lost in whatever storm raged inside her mind. Her footsteps echoed long after she disappeared around the corner. Prince Alexander appeared moments later. His jaw was set, his eyes dark. He paused in the doorway, breathing heavily before composing himself. Marcus kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, but he could feel the prince's fury radiating like heat from a fire. Alexander strode away in the opposite direction from his sister, heading toward the royal apartments. The palace staff moved with increased urgency after that. Maids hurried through their duties. Advisors clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. The head butler, a man who had served the family longer than Marcus had been alive, wore a worried expression. Even the usually cheerful kitchen staff worked in silence. Marcus remained at his post throughout the morning, but his mind raced with questions. What had caused such an explosive argument between the siblings? They had always been close despite their different temperaments. Alexander was traditional and cautious, following the established rules of monarchy. Helena was progressive and bold, constantly pushing for reforms and changes. Lunch service came and went. The dining hall remained empty. Prince Alexander took his meal in his chambers. Princess Helena did not eat at all, according to the maid who brought her tray back untouched. The king met with his advisors behind closed doors. The queen spent the afternoon in the chapel, praying. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Marcus noticed more guards being called to duty. Captain Reynolds, the head of palace security, made his rounds personally rather than delegating as usual. He stopped briefly to speak with Marcus, his voice low and concerned. The captain wanted to know if Marcus had observed anything unusual. Had anyone unauthorized entered the palace? Were there any suspicious movements? Marcus reported truthfully about the argument he had overheard, though he knew little of its content. Captain Reynolds nodded grimly and continued his inspection. Evening arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension. The usual dinner preparations proceeded, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety among the staff. Servants moved quietly, speaking only when necessary. The great chandeliers were lit, casting their warm glow over the marble floors. But the light seemed unable to dispel the darkness that had settled over the palace. Marcus took his evening meal in the guardroom with the others. The conversation was subdued. Everyone had heard something about the royal dispute, but no one knew the full story. Speculation ran wild. Some believed it was about the succession. Others whispered about political alliances and marriage proposals. Marcus ate in silence, listening but not contributing. As he returned to his post for the night watch, Marcus passed by the royal portrait gallery. The faces of kings and queens from centuries past stared down from their gilded frames. They had weathered wars, plagues, and political upheavals. Surely the current family could overcome whatever conflict divided them now. But as Marcus settled into his position for the long night ahead, he could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The argument between Alexander and Helena was not just a simple disagreement. It felt like the opening crack in a dam, a warning of the flood to come. He tightened his grip on his sword and prepared himself for whatever the coming days would bring. The palace halls were quiet now, but Marcus knew from experience that the deepest silence often preceded the greatest storms. The morning sun brought no relief to the tension gripping the palace. Marcus reported for duty to find Captain Reynolds already present, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. The captain gathered the guard detail for a brief meeting before their shifts began. His face was grave as he addressed them. Security protocols were being enhanced. Additional guards would patrol the private wings. All visitors required clearance from 2 separate officials. No one was to discuss palace matters outside these walls. The captain's eyes swept over each guard as he spoke, making sure his message was understood. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. These were wartime measures. King Edmund emerged from his study shortly after dawn. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He had clearly been awake most of the night. The king paused when he saw Marcus, studying him for a moment as if seeing him for the first time in years. Then he nodded slowly and continued toward the throne room. Prince Alexander appeared next, dressed formally for court business. But there was something different about him today. His movements were stiff, mechanical. The easy confidence he usually displayed had been replaced by a rigid determination. He carried a leather folder under his arm, thick with documents. When he spoke to his attendants, his voice was clipped and cold. Princess Helena stayed in her chambers until late morning. When she finally emerged, she wore a simple blue dress rather than her usual elaborate gowns. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her face held an expression Marcus had never seen before. It was not anger exactly, but something harder. Resolve, perhaps, or defiance. She walked past the royal portraits without glancing at them, heading directly to her father's study. The meeting between the king and princess lasted 3 hours. Marcus stood guard outside the study door, listening to the muffled sounds of discussion within. Their voices rose and fell, sometimes heated, sometimes pleading. He heard the princess cry at one point, a sound that struck his heart. Then silence, then more talking, quieter now. When Princess Helena finally left the study, her eyes were red but dry. She held her head high as she passed Marcus, refusing to show weakness. The king did not emerge. Marcus heard the sound of something heavy hitting a desk, then nothing. He remained at his post, torn between duty and concern for the man who ruled them all. The palace buzzed with nervous energy throughout the day. Servants rushed from room to room carrying messages. Advisors huddled in corners, their faces worried. The royal secretary made multiple trips between the king's study and the council chamber. Something significant was happening, but the details remained locked behind closed doors and sealed lips. Marcus caught fragments of conversation as people passed his post. He heard words like succession, amendment, tradition, and reform. One elderly advisor spoke angrily about breaking centuries of protocol. Another younger courtier argued passionately about progress and change. The palace seemed divided, with opinions falling along generational lines. Queen Margaret finally appeared in the early afternoon. She had always been the calm center of the royal family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found compromises. But today she looked frail and uncertain. She moved through the palace like a ghost speaking to no one, her usual warmth replaced by a distracted worry. The queen went first to her daughter's chambers, staying for over an hour. Then she visited her son's apartments. Marcus watched her emerge from each meeting looking more troubled than before. Finally, she returned to her husband's study. The door closed behind her, and Marcus heard raised voices almost immediately. It was not like the king and queen to fight. Throughout their marriage, they had presented a united front. They disagreed privately, but never publicly. Yet now their argument carried through the heavy door. The queen's normally gentle voice was sharp with emotion. The king's responses were defensive, almost desperate. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, feeling like an unwanted witness to something deeply personal. An emergency council meeting was called for late afternoon. All the senior advisors assembled in the council chamber. Prince Alexander arrived carrying his leather folder. Princess Helena came separately, flanked by two of her ladies. The king and queen entered last, sitting at opposite ends of the table rather than together as they usually did. Marcus and Thomas were assigned to guard the council chamber doors. No one was permitted entry once the meeting began. The discussions inside lasted for hours. Occasionally, voices would rise loud enough to be heard outside. Marcus recognized the passionate tones of the princess, the measured arguments of the king, the prince's angry interjections. As evening fell, the palace staff prepared dinner for the council members. Trays of food were brought to the chamber doors and left on tables in the corridor. No one came out to eat. The food grew cold. The guards changed shifts, but the meeting continued. Marcus handed his post to the night watch and headed to the guard quarters, exhausted but unable to sleep. He lay awake in his bunk, thinking about everything he had witnessed. The royal family was tearing itself apart, but he still did not understand why. What could be important enough to cause such division? What issue could drive a wedge between siblings who had always been close? Between parents who had always been united? Around midnight, word came that the council meeting had finally ended. Marcus heard footsteps in the corridor as the advisors made their way to their various quarters. He heard fragments of conversation. One advisor muttered about impossible choices. Another spoke of tradition versus progress. A third wondered aloud if the kingdom itself could survive what was coming. Marcus rose before dawn, unable to rest. He walked through the quiet palace corridors, past the sleeping chambers and silent halls. The building that had been his entire world suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if the conflict had changed the very walls. He thought of his father and grandfather, who had served these halls with honor. They had protected the royal family through difficult times. But had they ever witnessed anything like this? Had the palace ever been so deeply divided from within? As the first light of dawn touched the eastern windows, Marcus wondered what new developments the day would bring. The storm brewing within the palace walls showed no signs of passing. If anything, it seemed to be gathering strength. The third day brought clarity to what had been whispered speculation. An announcement was posted in the main hall before breakfast. Marcus read it twice, barely believing the words. Princess Helena had formally challenged a centuries-old law of succession. She was demanding equal consideration for the throne, regardless of gender. The kingdom had always followed male primogeniture. The crown passed to the eldest son, then to his brothers, and only to daughters if no male heirs existed. It had been this way for over 400 years. Princess Helena was not just proposing a change. She was demanding recognition of her own right to rule, potentially displacing her brother entirely. The palace erupted into chaos. Advisors argued in the corridors. Servants took sides, some supporting the princess's bold stance, others defending tradition. The older generation was horrified. The younger staff members buzzed with excitement about the possibility of change. Marcus stood at his post, watching the palace divide into two camps before his eyes. Prince Alexander released his own statement by midday. He spoke of duty, tradition, and the importance of stability. He emphasized his years of preparation for kingship, his training in statecraft and diplomacy. He was careful not to attack his sister directly, but his message was clear. He was the rightful heir, and he would not step aside willingly. Princess Helena held court in the library, surrounded by progressive advisors and younger nobles. They pored over legal documents and historical precedents. She was building a case, marshaling arguments, preparing for a formal challenge. Marcus watched people come and go from the library all day, their expressions animated with purpose and passion. King Edmund looked 10 years older. The weight of choosing between his children was crushing him. He had always loved them equally, been proud of both their strengths. Alexander's steady leadership and Helena's brilliant mind were both assets to the kingdom. But the law demanded he make a choice, and any choice would destroy part of his family. The king spent hours in private consultation with his most trusted advisors. Constitutional experts debated the legal pathways available. Could the law be changed? Did the king have the authority to name his own successor, or was his role merely ceremonial? The questions multiplied, each answer leading to 3 more complications. Queen Margaret tried desperately to broker peace between her children. She arranged a private dinner, hoping family bonds could overcome political ambition. But the meal ended in disaster. Helena accused Alexander of being blind to the injustice of the current system. Alexander countered that Helena was willing to tear apart the kingdom for personal glory. They left the table without touching their food. The queen wept in her chambers afterward. Her ladies tried to comfort her, but there were no words adequate for a mother watching her children become enemies. She had raised them to be strong, to stand up for their beliefs. Now those same qualities were driving them apart. Marcus saw her walking the palace gardens alone at night, a small figure dwarfed by the shadows of the great trees. Public opinion began to seep into the palace from the city beyond. Messengers brought reports of debates in taverns and town squares. The common people were divided just as the nobles were. Some saw Princess Helena as a champion of progress and equality. Others viewed her challenge as dangerous upheaval that threatened the natural order. Prince Alexander received delegations of traditional nobles who pledged their support. They spoke of duty, honor, and the importance of maintaining the established order. They warned of the chaos that could follow if centuries of precedent were overturned. The prince listened carefully, his resolve strengthening with each meeting. Princess Helena met with reform-minded citizens and younger nobles hungry for change. They brought stories of talented women held back by outdated laws, of potential wasted because of arbitrary rules about gender. They argued that the kingdom could be stronger, better if merit mattered more than birthright. The princess absorbed every argument, her determination growing fiercer. Marcus found himself caught between admiration and concern. He respected the princess's courage in challenging an unjust system, but he also understood the prince's position. Alexander had been groomed for kingship his entire life. Every choice he made, every lesson he learned had been focused on preparing him to rule. Now that future was in jeopardy through no fault of his own. The guard force remained officially neutral, but Marcus knew his fellow guards had private opinions. Some admired Princess Helena's fire. Others respected Prince Alexander's steadiness. A few worried that the conflict could escalate into something more dangerous. Captain Reynolds worked overtime to keep the peace, reminding everyone that their duty was to the crown, not to any individual royal. As the week progressed, formal procedures began. Lawyers drafted petitions. Constitutional scholars prepared briefs. The machinery of government, usually invisible, suddenly became the focus of intense scrutiny. Every clause of every law was examined, debated, interpreted. The kingdom's founding documents were pulled from archives and studied under magnifying glasses. The atmosphere in the palace grew increasingly tense. Simple conversations became awkward as people avoided taking positions that might offend either side. Meals were eaten in silence. The usual social gatherings were canceled. Even the servants moved quietly, afraid that any misstep might be interpreted as choosing a side in the royal conflict. Marcus maintained his routine, but everything felt different. The palace that had been his home, his sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield. Invisible lines had been drawn. Every person had to choose where they stood, whether they wanted to or not. Neutrality itself was becoming impossible. Late one night, Marcus encountered Princess Helena in the portrait gallery. She stood before the painting of the kingdom's founder, studying the stern face of the man who had written the laws she now challenged. She did not notice Marcus at first, lost in thought. When she finally saw him, she spoke quietly, almost to herself. She said that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. That progress required courage to challenge what had always been. Then she walked away, leaving Marcus alone with the portraits of long-dead kings and the weight of history pressing down on them all. The formal hearing was set for the Great Hall. It would be the first time such a challenge had been brought before the royal court in living memory. Workers spent 3 days preparing the chamber. arranging seating for nobles, advisors, and witnesses. The throne remained empty, as the king would preside as judge rather than participant in this unprecedented event. Marcus was assigned to the security detail for the hearing. Captain Reynolds personally briefed the guards on their duties. They were to maintain absolute order and impartiality. Any disruption would be dealt with immediately. The captain's face was grim as he spoke. He knew as well as anyone that this hearing could determine not just the succession, but the future direction of the entire kingdom. The night before the hearing, Marcus could not sleep. He walked the palace corridors, checking locks and testing doors. In the great hall, moonlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the prepared chamber. The space felt sacred somehow, as if it understood the weight of what would happen within its walls. Marcus stood in the center of the room, imagining tomorrow's scene. Dawn came too quickly. The palace awoke early, everyone preparing for the momentous day. Servants laid out formal attire for the royal family. Advisors rehearsed their arguments one final time. The kitchen staff prepared refreshments, though no one expected much appetite. The tension was so thick it seemed to slow time itself, making every minute feel like an hour. Nobles and courtiers began arriving mid-morning. They filed into the great hall in order of rank, their faces revealing their allegiances. The older generation wore expressions of disapproval, some openly scowling. The younger nobles looked excited, energized by the possibility of witnessing history. Marcus scanned each face, watching for signs of trouble. Prince Alexander entered first, accompanied by his legal counsel and several senior advisors. He wore his dress uniform, every medal and decoration polished to perfection. He moved with military precision, acknowledging supporters with crisp nods. His face was carefully neutral, but Marcus noticed his hands were clenched behind his back. The prince took his position on the right side of the hall. Princess Helena arrived moments later. She wore a deep blue gown, simple but elegant, with her grandmother's pearls at her throat. Her advisors flanked her, a mix of legal scholars and reform advocates. Unlike her brother, she made eye contact with everyone, meeting each gaze directly. She seemed to draw strength from the attention rather than shrink from it. She took her place on the left side of the hall. Queen Margaret entered through a side door, moving to a seat separate from both her children. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the conflict tearing her family apart. Her eyes were red from crying, but she held herself with dignity. Several ladies accompanied her, providing what comfort they could. The queen gazed at her children across the hall, her face a portrait of maternal anguish. Finally, King Edmund entered. The entire assembly rose as one. The king moved slowly to his position at the head of the hall, not quite sitting on the throne itself, but at a judge's bench specially prepared for this occasion. He looked at his children in turn, and Marcus saw the pain in his eyes. This was not a father presiding over a debate. This was a king forced to judge between his own flesh and blood. The Chief Justice called the hearing to order. The formal charges were read. Princess Helena was challenging the law of succession on grounds that it violated principles of equality and merit. She sought recognition as a co-heir with her brother, or alternatively recognition as the sole heir based on her qualifications to rule. The words echoed in the vast chamber, making the challenge feel even more monumental. Prince Alexander's council spoke first. They presented the weight of tradition, 4 centuries of unbroken succession law. They argued that stability required consistency, that changing fundamental laws in response to individual ambition would set a dangerous precedent. They spoke of the prince's lifelong preparation, his understanding of statecraft, his relationships with foreign powers. Their arguments were logical, measured, backed by mountains of legal precedent. Princess Helena's advisors countered with passion and principle. They cited examples from other kingdoms where succession laws had evolved. They presented evidence of the princess's capabilities, her diplomatic successes, her innovative solutions to domestic problems. They argued that justice mattered more than tradition, that laws created by men could be changed by men when they were found to be unjust. Their arguments appealed to ideals of fairness and progress. The debate continued for hours. Legal scholars presented interpretations of constitutional documents. Historical experts testified about past succession disputes. Economic advisors discussed the potential impacts of change versus continuity. Every angle was examined, every argument dissected. Marcus listened carefully, trying to follow the complex legal reasoning. Then came the personal testimonies. Prince Alexander spoke of his sense of duty, his dedication to serving the kingdom. He acknowledged his sister's talents but argued that he had been specifically prepared for the throne in ways she had not. His voice remained steady throughout, though Marcus detected the emotion beneath the formal words. This was not just about power for Alexander. It was about fulfilling the purpose he had trained for his entire life. Princess Helena's testimony was more emotional. She spoke of watching her brother receive opportunities denied to her simply because of gender. She described the frustration of being equally capable but perpetually overlooked. She argued that the kingdom deserved the best leader, regardless of whether that leader was male or female. Her voice rang with conviction, and Marcus saw several younger nobles nodding in agreement. The most difficult moment came when King Edmund asked his children directly if reconciliation was possible. Could they share power? Could they find a compromise? Prince Alexander spoke of constitutional constraints and the need for clear authority. Princess Helena argued that compromise without real change was just maintaining injustice. They were not negotiating different positions. They held fundamentally opposing views about what was right. As the afternoon wore on, the king called for a recess. People filed out of the great hall in hushed groups discussing what they had witnessed. Marcus remained at his post, watching the royal family disperse to separate corners of the palace. The queen went to the chapel. The prince retreated to his study. The princess walked in the gardens. The king sat alone in the great hall, staring at the empty space between where his children had stood. Marcus realized that no matter what decision came from this hearing, the damage was already done. The royal family would never be the same. Trust had been broken. Love had been tested to its limits. The conflict had exposed divisions that could never be completely healed. Even if one side prevailed, the victory would be hollow, tainted by the cost of winning. As evening shadows filled the great hall, Marcus understood that sometimes there were no good choices, only difficult ones, and the palace would bear the scars of this conflict for generations to come. King Edmund did not announce his decision immediately. He retired to his private chambers for 3 days of contemplation. No one was permitted to see him except the queen, and even those visits were brief. The entire palace held its breath, waiting for the verdict that would shape the kingdom's future. During those 3 days, the tension became almost unbearable. Prince Alexander paced the corridors like a caged animal. His advisors tried to keep him occupied with other matters, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. He snapped at servants, apologized immediately, then retreated further into his isolation. Marcus watched the prince age before his eyes, stress carving new lines into his face. Princess Helena threw herself into work. She met with her supporters, drafted policy proposals, and planned for either outcome. But Marcus noticed her hand shaking when she thought no one was watching. She ate little and slept less. Her fierce determination was still there, but underneath it was fear. Fear of losing, certainly, but also perhaps fear of what winning would mean. The palace staff divided into whispered factions. Some predicted the king would uphold tradition and name Alexander as heir. Others believed he would side with his daughter's demand for equality. A few speculated about compromise solutions, though no one could quite imagine what form such a compromise might take. The uncertainty wore on everyone's nerves. On the morning of the 4th day, word spread that the king would announce his decision at noon. The great hall filled quickly. Nobles jostled for position. Courtiers whispered final predictions. Foreign ambassadors attended, understanding that this decision would reverberate beyond the kingdom's borders. Marcus took his position near the main entrance, his hand steady on his weapon despite the chaos in his mind. King Edmund entered the hall looking older than Marcus had ever seen him. His crown seemed too heavy for his head. His robes hung on his frame as if he had lost weight during his days of isolation, but his eyes were clear and his voice was steady when he called the assembly to order. This was still a king, whatever personal anguish he carried. The king began by acknowledging the difficulty of the decision before him. He spoke of his love for both his children, his pride in their accomplishments, his pain at being forced to choose between them. His voice cracked slightly as he looked at Alexander and Helena in turn. The entire hall seemed to lean forward, desperate to hear what came next. Then King Edmund announced his verdict. He would not change the succession law immediately. Prince Alexander remained the heir apparent according to current law, But the king was calling for a constitutional amendment process to begin. Within 5 years, the kingdom would vote on whether to adopt equal succession rights. The future could be different, but not yet. Not today. The reaction was instantaneous and mixed. Alexander's supporters erupted in relieved applause. Helena's faction sat in stunned silence before beginning angry murmurs. The princess herself stood frozen, her face a mask of controlled emotion. The prince looked torn between relief and guilt. Neither side had truly won. Neither had truly lost. Everyone had received half of what they wanted and half of what they feared. King Edmund continued speaking, his voice rising above the noise. He explained his reasoning. Tradition could not be discarded overnight without risking chaos. But justice demanded that outdated laws be examined and potentially changed. The 5-year timeline would allow for thoughtful debate rather than hasty revolution. It would give the kingdom time to prepare for potential change while maintaining stability in the present. Princess Helena rose to speak. For a moment, Marcus thought she would reject the compromise entirely. Her face was rigid with emotion. But when she spoke, her voice was measured. She acknowledged her father's wisdom in seeking a middle path. She pledged to spend the next 5 years proving her capability to lead. She would make it impossible for the kingdom to deny her the crown she deserved. Her words carried both acceptance and defiance. Prince Alexander also addressed the assembly. He thanked his father for upholding the law while acknowledging the need for progress. He promised to rule justly if called upon, but he also committed to supporting the constitutional review process. His words were diplomatic, carefully neutral, but Marcus detected the relief beneath them. Alexander had been granted the succession he expected, even if the ground beneath that succession was no longer as solid as before. The days following the announcement were strange. The immediate crisis had passed, but the underlying tensions remained. Princess Helena threw herself into public service with renewed energy. She visited hospitals, schools, and community centers. She met with citizens and listened to their concerns. She was building support for the eventual referendum, making herself visible and valuable to the people who would one day vote on her future. Prince Alexander focused on his traditional duties as heir. He attended state functions, met with foreign dignitaries, and studied matters of governance. But there was a new wariness in his interactions with his sister. They were cordial when circumstances demanded it, but the easy affection they once shared was gone. They were no longer just siblings. They were rivals, even if that rivalry had been temporarily suspended. King Edmund visibly aged in the weeks after his decision. The strain of the conflict had taken its toll. He still performed his royal duties, but there was a sadness about him that had not been there before. He had tried to satisfy both his children, and had succeeded in fully pleasing neither. He had preserved the kingdom but fractured his family. The cost of compromise weighed heavily on his shoulders. Queen Margaret worked tirelessly to repair the family bonds. She organized private dinners, casual garden walks, any excuse to bring her children together. Some of these attempts succeeded in creating moments of genuine warmth. Others ended in awkward silence or thinly veiled arguments. The Queen persevered, refusing to give up on the hope that time might heal what politics had wounded. Marcus observed all of this from his post, a silent witness to the palace's transformation. The building itself seemed different now. The hallways that had once echoed with laughter now carried more careful footsteps. The dining halls that had hosted joyful gatherings now felt formal and constrained. The palace had survived the conflict, but it had been changed by it. As weeks became months, life in the palace found a new rhythm. It was not the comfortable routine of before, but it was functional. People learned to navigate the new reality. Conversations avoided certain topics. Seating arrangements were carefully planned. The royal family appeared together for official events, presenting a united front to the public while maintaining careful distance in private. The storm had passed, leaving everyone to assess the damage and wonder what the future would bring when the constitutional question arose again in 5 years' time. 2 years passed since King Edmund's compromise decision. The palace had settled into its new reality, though the underlying tension never fully disappeared. Marcus continued his daily routine, but he no longer took the peace for granted. He had learned that even the strongest institutions could be shaken from within, that family bonds could fray under the pressure of principle and ambition. Princess Helena had become a force throughout the kingdom. She traveled extensively, meeting citizens in every province. Her speeches about equality and justice drew large crowds. Young people especially flocked to hear her speak. She had transformed from a palace princess into a national figure, building a movement that extended far beyond the question of succession. Her popularity grew steadily, making her an undeniable presence in the kingdom's future. Prince Alexander took a different approach. He focused on demonstrating his readiness to rule through steady competence. He chaired important committees, negotiated trade agreements, and handled diplomatic crises with skill. He was less flashy than his sister, but his work was substantial. Those who valued experience and stability increasingly saw him as the safe choice, the known quantity in uncertain times. The kingdom itself had become invested in the debate. Newspapers ran editorials arguing both sides. Universities held forums on constitutional law and succession rights. Citizens who had never cared about palace politics suddenly had strong opinions about who should inherit the throne. The personal conflict between two siblings had evolved into a national conversation about values, tradition, and the direction of the kingdom. Marcus witnessed small moments of connection between the royal siblings that gave him hope. Once he saw Princess Helena laugh at something Prince Alexander said during a state dinner. Another time, the prince defended his sister against a critic's harsh words. They were still family despite everything. But these moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the larger forces pulling them apart. King Edmund's health began to decline. The stress of the succession conflict, combined with the normal burdens of ruling, had taken a heavy toll. His doctors prescribed rest, but the king refused to step away from his duties. He seemed driven by a need to see the constitutional process through, to ensure his compromise would hold even after he was gone. Queen Margaret stayed constantly by his side, her worry evident to everyone who saw her. The approaching referendum date loomed large in everyone's consciousness. Constitutional experts had drafted the amendment that would be put to a vote. If passed, it would establish equal succession rights regardless of gender. The eldest child, whether male or female, would inherit the throne. It seemed simple on paper, but everyone understood the profound implications. Prince Alexander grew quieter as the vote approached. He had always known this day would come, but facing the reality was different from anticipating it. He might win the vote and secure his position, or he might lose everything he had been raised to expect. The uncertainty gnawed at him, visible in the tension of his shoulders and the careful measure of his words. Princess Helena campaigned tirelessly in the months before the referendum. She framed it not as a personal quest for power, but as a matter of justice and equality. She spoke about daughters who deserved the same opportunities as sons, about talent that should not be wasted because of arbitrary rules. Her message resonated, but whether it would resonate enough remained uncertain. The vote finally came on a crisp autumn morning. Across the kingdom, citizens lined up to cast their ballots. It was the largest turnout for any referendum in the kingdom's history. People waited hours to vote, understanding they were participating in something historic. The palace was eerily quiet as everyone waited for results that would not come until evening. Marcus spent the day at his post, watching the royal family cope with the waiting. The king sat in his study, surrounded by advisors but looking profoundly alone. The queen prayed in the chapel. Prince Alexander went through the motions of his duties, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Princess Helena walked the palace grounds, unable to sit still, burning nervous energy with constant movement. As evening fell, the results began to trickle in. The urban areas voted strongly in favor of the amendment. Rural regions were more divided. The older generation leaned toward tradition. Young voters overwhelmingly supported change. The nation was split, not cleanly, but enough to make the outcome uncertain until the very last votes were counted. The final count came just before midnight. The amendment passed by a margin of 53% to 47%. Not a landslide, but enough. Equal succession was now the law of the kingdom. Princess Helena, as the more accomplished and popular of the two heirs, would be recognized as having equal claim to the throne alongside her brother. The immediate reaction in the palace was muted shock. King Edmund closed his eyes briefly. Whether in relief or resignation, Marcus could not tell. Queen Margaret reached for her husband's hand. Prince Alexander stood motionless, processing the news that his destiny was no longer guaranteed. Princess Helena wept, but whether from joy or the overwhelming weight of what lay ahead, no one could say. In the days that followed, the kingdom began adjusting to its new reality. Legal scholars worked to clarify the implications of the amendment. Would there be co-regents? Would merit determine the final choice? The questions that had supposedly been answered by the referendum only led to new uncertainties. The palace prepared for what could be years of further negotiation and compromise. Prince Alexander and Princess Helena met privately the morning after the vote. No one knew what they discussed, but they emerged with a joint statement. They would work together to serve the kingdom, putting its needs above their personal ambitions. They acknowledged the will of the people while committing to respect each other's contributions. It was diplomatic and carefully worded, revealing nothing of what they truly felt. Marcus realized that the conflict he had witnessed was not over. It had simply entered a new phase. The siblings were still rivals, but now they were rivals operating under new rules, in a kingdom that had declared both of them worthy of the crown. The question was no longer about changing the law. It was about who would ultimately rule under the changed law. As Marcus stood at his post that night looking out over the palace grounds, he thought about everything that had changed. The conflict had transformed the royal family, the palace, and the kingdom itself. It had forced everyone to examine their beliefs about tradition, justice, and leadership. There were no simple answers, no clear victories. There was only the difficult work of moving forward together. The palace lights glowed in the darkness, a symbol of continuity despite change. Inside those walls, a family struggled with love and ambition, duty and desire. Marcus had witnessed their conflict from the beginning, standing guard as their world transformed. He did not know what the future would bring, whether peace or further upheaval, but he knew his place. He was a guard, sworn to protect the royal family through whatever came next. And he would stand his post, watching and waiting as the story of the kingdom continued to unfold around him. The pandemonium had subsided, but its echoes would resonate through the palace halls for years to come. A reminder that even the strongest foundations can be tested, and that sometimes the greatest conflicts are those fought within families, where love and ambition are impossible to separate.